ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. So I think probably Callum Macrae doesn't need much introduction to many of you. Documentary filmmaker, he's made the Killing Fields films on Channel 4 on Sri Lanka on the 2009 war, and also No Far Zone in various different incarnations and languages. And Shivani Jegarajah, immigration barrister, and I have to say, I look at Shivani and I feel quite guilty because there's so many times I interrupt her private life, family life, home life by ringing up saying, oh, I've got this client, can you save them? And she always steps in and, you know, Friday evenings, whatever it is, ends up doing emergency injunctions for people who are facing deportation, and the last one was Thursday last week, so I'm ashamed to keep on ruining your life, Shivani, but thank you. She's done a tremendous amount to help individuals. And then Kirsty Brimelow, the chairwoman of the Bar Human Rights Committee and barrister in Doughty Street. And we'll start with the three panelists making short 10-minute speeches, 10-minute addresses, and then we'll open the questions to the audience. We've got a fairly small audience, so I think we'll open it up fairly quickly and have a discussion moving forward. And as you know, of course, the issue being discussed today is whether the delay of the OHCHR investigation in Sri Lanka will help the victims. But I think it'll probably broaden out and we'll end up talking quite a bit about the change of government in Sri Lanka and what the implications of that could be. I also should point out that it's the UN International Day of Right to Truth concerning gross human rights violations and the dignity of victims. Just to note that. I think if you don't mind, I'll start with Callum first, if you'd like to go ahead and find your notes.
Yes, I'm slightly embarrassment on the notes front, but I'm sure I'll pass it. What I'd like to do is basically outline what I think has happened, give you my interpretation, which I'm confident and hopeful that people will disagree with, of what's been happening and what should happen. But I think it's quite useful to kind of outline it as a kind of starting point. Last January, a couple of months ago, there was an absolutely massive change in Sri Lanka, a huge change, a significant change, and a change which we should not underestimate. What we saw was, what had been happening is a regime which, as I think everybody was aware, was sinking ever further into a kind of despotic morass, a combination of ultra-nationalist chauvinism, paranoia, and an underlying current of racism, which was used to cover up and to justify a climate where you saw huge scale, massive scale corruption, nepotism, disappearances, and you had some really quite sinister developments in terms of a combination of not just things like death squads who were going around executing opponents of the government, but also BBS, ultra-right, ultra-nationalistic chauvinist organisations who were actually, again, sort of state-sponsored and who were initiating and causing, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, crystal nacht-like events in which there were attacks on Muslims and attacks on Christians, in the sense that the perception being that the Tamils had in effect been defeated and were continuing to be defeated, as it were, in the north and east. And so it was a very, very dangerous climate, and I think one that caused a huge amount of concern. Now, that's gone. The rule of law has been reinstated to some extent. Freedom of the press has been reinstated to some extent, not as much as we might hope. Nepotism and political appointments have ended. The political appointees, the diplomats who were sent around the world as reward for war services, but also to keep an eye on the diaspora, have been, the worst of them have been summoned back. There's also been a significant shift away from Rajapaksa's mercenary kind of alliance and drift towards China. Speaking to the West, there has also been promises of reconciliation and talk of peace and reconciliation and justice. Those kind of promises were made, although, you know, how different, we have to look at how serious those were. Certainly in terms of just promises of reconciliation, that's no difference from actually what we used to get from Rajapaksa. But I think for all these incredibly positive developments, which we should not underestimate, they're hugely significant. I think, you know, Sri Lanka has moved away from the brink. However, there is a but, and it's a huge but. And that is to do with it's to do with what was promised, what Sirisena's government promised. Because what Sirisena's government, on the key issues of truth, justice, and political ways forward, the message was being given, which was very different. I mean, who voted for him? The Muslims voted for him. They didn't vote for him. They voted against Rajapaksa because of BBS and what had been going on there. The Tamils did not vote for him. They voted against Rajapaksa. He, you know, and he obviously welcomed that, and it was very significant in his election. But it's what he was saying to his singular electorate, without which he would not have won, which I think is very significant. And I mean, if you look at some of the things he said, you know, I will end corruption, I will do all these kind of things, the nepotism you hate, the corruption you hate, all this kind of stuff that you hate, the repression of any kind of dissension. And I will give you democracy. But he also said, and these are a couple of quotes, during his election campaign, he made absolutely clear, he said, I was in charge on key days during the war because I was the acting Minister of Defence. Now, actually, he wasn't that significant, you know, as Minister of Defence. It was clearly continued to be run by the Rajapaksas, whether they're in or out of the country. And actually, he would have got away with it in any eventual war crimes. He would have said, look, okay, I mean, technically I was in charge, but you know as well as I do, I wasn't. But that's not what he said to his electorate. What he said to his electorate is, I was in charge, I was responsible. He claimed responsibility for what happened in the last few days of the war. In an address, in singular language, part of political address, he actually said, I will not allow any foreign country or international court to accuse, prosecute, or punish anyone who is committed to defeating terrorism. Now, leaving aside the sort of my country, right or wrong, kind of jingoism of that, the fact is that what he was saying there, what he was describing as committed to fighting terrorism, is what the rest of the world might regard as war crimes, crimes against humanity, or other offences, which I know that will come up in our discussions. This is a man who we are now told is serious about launching a domestic inquiry. A man who has publicly, in his election address, and is elected on the basis of saying that what happened at the end of the war was fighting terrorism. Now, he also presented, and there's lots of other things, he presented Sarah Fonseca during his election campaign as a very, very close ally. Sarah Fonseca was doing interviews in Times of India, in which he said, it was me that ran the war, I ran the whole war from start to finish, it was nothing to do with Rajapaksa, it was all me. I mean, that's a bit of a paraphrase, but it is what he was saying. So the problem is that what Sirisena was actually doing in his election campaign was he was promising democracy to the south. He was promising democracy to the Sinhala in particular, and to a great extent he has begun to deliver on that. Now, he won. He has made other concessions. We'll come back to this. I mean, there have been some changes in there. We shouldn't dismiss them. We need to look at exactly what's happening, be realistic about what's happening. What did happen, and once he was elected, there was a huge issue, and the huge issue was the international inquiry and what had happened about truth and justice. And in a sense, the international community was thrown into complete disarray, I should say, thrown into complete disarray by his victory. And you had a whole lot of conflicting and rethinking, if you like, going on. There were, in the West, in America, siren voices representing the kind of America's geopolitical, geostrategic interests. The people, because up until then, America had spoken broadly with a united voice. Broadly, it had been campaigning. It had proposed a resolution that led to the OISL inquiry. But suddenly, what you saw was America was no longer speaking with a united voice, and effectively, you saw that the forces. I suppose the voices and the forces that represented that were interested in America's geostrategic interests, the voices from the Pentagon, from the military, from the economic interests, who had previously been quite happy to go along with the human rights argument because it was a way of bashing Rajapaksa, who was looking increasingly to China, suddenly changed their tune. because you now had a government which was westward leaning and India leaning. And they started saying, I mean, there was a woman, Teresita, what's her name? Teresita Schaefer, that's right, who used to be an American ambassador in Sri Lanka. And she wrote a speech in which she actually said that we should lower our voice in human rights, that we should be giving the UN human rights investigation should be not just postponed, but suspended, but stopped, called off, while the new team gets its balance. Right? So I think that, you know, there was suddenly a concern that America was no longer speaking a united voice, was no longer speaking, and also that was reflected, I think, in what was happening with other elements. So that, for example, you had there were people who were concerned with human rights who were genuinely saying, well, look, that political considerations started playing a part. If we push this inquiry, if there is a vote and it goes and it endorses the inquiry and goes to the next stage of some kind of judicial process, this could damage Sirisena. That this could provoke a kind of reaction from the Rajapaksas. Equally, there was also a fear that if you pushed for the vote now, it could lead to a defeat on the Human Rights Council. So there was a whole lot of confusion. Now, I personally believe that it is incredibly dangerous if you take something which is effectively a quasi-judicial, independent human rights investigation and say that it can be used as some kind of political bargaining tool, or that its release should be timed to coincide to benefit one group or another. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. I think it should have been published. I think that for the people who had testified to it, for the people of the North and East who invested such hope in it, it felt like an absolute betrayal. So I do think it was a mistake. I think it should have been published. I think that once it was out there, there's a fear also that if it's by being held back, it will eventually be lost and disappear. On that, actually, I think that there is less concern. I think that what happens over the next 6 months is critical. So I think that in a sense, that's what we have to concentrate on. The reality is it has not been published. So the reality is what will happen next? Will the delay allow the Sri Lankan government, as many fear, and certainly as people as Tamil from the North and the West, North and the East fear, be used as a mechanism to somehow lose it and to give them time to knock it on the head? Or will it allow, and it's very significant, I think, that you saw that it was portrayed in two different ways, the delay. The Sirisena government portrayed it as a response to their request, that they be given more time, that they will set up their own domestic inquiry, and that they should be given time to set up the domestic inquiry. So thank you very much for delaying the report while we do our alternative. Zaid presented it completely differently, and it's quite significant, the two different visions sent out in the same press release, incidentally. And Zaid said that the Human Rights Commissioner, High Commissioner, said this gives us an opportunity to strengthen the report, to go into Sri Lanka and to get more information and to strengthen the report. So what happened? We know exactly what happened, and I think you just need to, Sirisena, when he was in London, in his interview with the BBC Sinhala service, made it quite clear. He said that what's going to happen is that we are not letting anybody in, and we are setting up a domestic inquiry, and so the whole Zaid justification for delay, which we can make it stronger, was knocked on the head. I think that the question is what happens over the next 6 months, and it seems to me that there are three dynamics going on, and the three dynamics which are going on, or which affect, if you like, the Sirisena government. One is that they are under pressure. Their alignment with the West promises all sorts of advantages. It promises economic advantages, it promises political advantages. If the West uses, and that gives the West and the international community, not just the West actually, but the international community, weapons which could be used to pressurize the Sirisena government to go on making genuine steps towards peace and justice, genuine steps towards judicial processes, genuine steps towards political reform. It seems to me that those weapons, those, if you like, carrots, are largely being wasted rather Burma style, and that this pressure is not being put on. There are two other dynamics, and those are one, who is Sirisena ultimately answerable to, and he is ultimately answerable to a singular constituency, which he has encouraged to continue to hold the same beliefs. He's not challenged those beliefs fundamentally. He has still, the stuff that I talked about earlier in his election campaign, that he is pandering to, at best, the singular nationalism, the chauvinism, the notion that Sri Lanka is a unitary state, that there can be no other political solution, and that fundamentally the Tamils are a threat, and political change is a threat to the unity of the Sri Lankan state. So he's still, that is a dynamic, and if the international community takes off the pressure, as people are arguing over the next 6 months to give them time, it seems to me that that dynamic will overwhelm. There is a second dynamic, which I've touched on already, which is the dynamic which is caused by their complicity, which is that they are complicit, that significant people in that government are complicit in the war crimes, and again, that's a disincentive to do any kind of genuine judicial process. And I think that if you look at who Sirisena appointed as the chief of the army, the new commander of the army, De Silva, was actually he was appointed as head of the Court of Inquiry by Rajapaksa to investigate the allegations specifically. This was a proposal from Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. There would be a court of inquiry set up to investigate Channel 4's allegations, the allegations in our film. The man put in charge of that, the president of that court, who eventually concluded, let's see if I can find it, but basically I'll remember it. He basically concluded that there were absolutely no grounds, that there had been no war crimes, that the army were guilty, that the army had pursued had adhered strictly to a campaign, to the policy of zero civilian casualties, and that all the deaths were caused by the LTTE. In other words, there were no war crimes. That is the man who has just been appointed in charge of in charge of the army. There are real concerns. I mean, there are a number of other issues which relate to that. Sorry, I did warn you that I had a problem with my notes, which didn't print out, so I'm kind of busking it here. I do apologize. The other problem is that when Sirisena was here in the BBC last week, a week before, whenever it was, a couple of weeks ago, he was actually asked again about my film and whether the film would be shown, and he said, so much for freedom of the press, he actually said, well, I haven't seen it yet, and I'll need to see it before I can decide whether it's allowed to be shown. He's a man who's carrying the world, he's going to be introduced to free press. But he also said, when he was asked about the allegations in the film, I don't believe such things. He said, we have to reject these things. I don't believe such things. We have questions about how they obtained all this information to change the situation in our country and to mislead the international community about the situation. Right? And this again is coming from the man who is telling the world that he can be trusted to set up a domestic inquiry into allegations which he says here quite clearly he doesn't believe and he rejects. So there is a huge problem with the credibility of a domestic inquiry. And that is a problem. There is also kind of the traditional problem in Sri Lanka, which is that Sri Lanka has had more domestic inquiries and commissions and everything else than almost every other country in the world put together, and has printed far less than almost every other country, than any other country in the world. Those are real concerns. So, if a domestic inquiry, if a genuine domestic inquiry is in effect out of the question, and I believe that it is, and there's another reason actually that we have to worry about a domestic inquiry, which is that any kind of, and actually I'll clarify that even more, any kind of judicial process in Sri Lanka has to have the confidence of the victims. And that is a very, very real, I'll bow to my legal superiors on this, but it seems to me, certainly as a layman, that if the victims do not have confidence in the independence of the court, then that court, it is virtually impossible for that court or that judicial process to operate successfully. If if you combine that with the fear of intimidation and victimization and all the rest of it, and I know that other people are going to talk about that, then you have even bigger a problem. What happens? What do we do? Well, I mean, it seems to me that the situation is actually quite clear, but time up. The situation is actually quite very clear. The situation is actually quite clear. What you have 6 months ago, when the UN voted to set up an inquiry, it did so on principle which underlies most of what the UN does, and which is very explicitly explained in the responsibility to protect, which is that if a country, if a people are suffering war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing or genocide, then it is the duty, first of all, of the state to stop that happening. If the state fails to stop that happening, or indeed if the state is actually responsible for that happening, then the international community has an obligation and a duty to intervene. Now, I think that applies. That is why it was in despair that the UN eventually said the Rajapaksa regime is not capable of mounting this independent inquiry. So, the new government has to demonstrate that something has changed before the UN's position should change one iota. The Human Rights Council's position should change one iota. So it's not good enough for them to rush around and say, oh, we're much better, we're democratic, we're doing all these kind of things. If the fundamental basis of their ability to organise a judicial process has not changed, then nothing has changed, and therefore the UN has to go with it. And I mean, I've got lots of other things to say about that, but I'll stop now and I'll try and sneak them in later.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll get a chance to put them in later. I should just say at this point, when everybody's here, that I understand from the organisers that the Sri Lankan High Commission were contacted by email, by letter, and by telephone, and asked to send a representative or nominate somebody, and they declined to do so. They said I think they were too busy. That was the answer they gave. So that explains why they're not present on the panel, if anyone has questions about that. I'd like to ask Shivani to go next, if you don't mind.
There are two hats. I am a Tamil activist, but I'm not speaking as a Tamil activist. I'm speaking as a lawyer who is very interested in ensuring that the report is an effective and credible report eventually, and one that has integrity. And for those reasons, I completely understand why there was going to be, or there should be, a deferment for some time, because there is a new government, and the new government clearly has a very different political outlook, certainly in terms of chauvinism and wanting to introduce what they perceive to be credible accountability, domestic accountability measures. And I can see in the long term that if you produce a report that hasn't engaged with the current government's attempts to change things, and I can see that there would be a lot of force in the government of Sri Lanka saying, well, actually, we came to power actually with a Tamil vote, and if you read the debates in Parliament in support of the witness protection legislation, you will certainly see that the tenor of the debates in Parliament are very, very different to the debates previously under the Rajapaksa regime. And so if you just look long term, as if it was a chess game, and if we don't support the government of Sri Lanka's interest and they're being very proactive in trying to implement change within a very short period of time, then certainly the report will have or may be challenged on the basis that we haven't, or rather the OISL haven't engaged with that positivism. And that's why I think pragmatically and also legally, in order for any prospective report to have any weight, it is right that, as the UN officials have said, that the current government has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to provide this change. So that's the first thing I want to say. I want to say that with the background of 21 years' experience of representing asylum seekers fleeing from both the Sri Lankan army and the LTT, particularly during the ceasefire time when clearly there was credible evidence of extrajudicial assassination. So in terms of and appreciating the mixed audience that we have here, I don't want it to be thought that there is like a monolithic view that Tamils have. I mean, they clearly don't, because as I said, the government wouldn't have got in power without the Tamil vote. So that's the first thing I want to say. I also want to say positively that Sri Lanka historically has had a tradition of a free press and a fair judiciary. And in terms of its political background, certainly in the 50s and the 60s, and in terms of Asia as a whole, Southeast Asia, was one of the had very progressive political socialist movements. And all of that history has to be taken on board when we look at both sides of the argument. Now, having said that, I want to look closely at one of the most significant legal developments in Sri Lanka, which is the Act that was passed in February 2015. Now, the full wording of the Act is the Assistance to and Protection of Victims of Crime and Witnesses Act, and it was passed through very quickly in February 2015. And I would recommend that people do read the proponents of the bill, because it was a piece of legislation that came through Parliament very, very quickly. And surprisingly, if you did read some of the speeches, you'd think that actually they were sort of employed by Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, because they were really quite forthright and they were really quite critical of the chauvinistic, xenophobic sort of Rajapaksa regime, sort of thinking that any international criticism or calls for accountability meant it was imperialism, basically. So I think those trends are very significant, but we should also recognise that the current legislation in February 2015 has a very long history. It was first mooted and actually recommended by the IIGEP, the International Independent Group of Eminent Persons, way back in 2006, when that group, which was an international group made up of jurists and so on, were asked to look into disappearances and graves. So yes, it is very significant, but we have to look at institutional change, and speaking as looking at it in two parts. One, what does this mean for witnesses? Now, obviously, I'm talking about witnesses who are Tamils, because in terms of the LTT, there is no LTTE, and we have to recognise that part of the Rajapaksa regime, or part of the Rajapaksa rhetoric, was to say, well, any demands for a Tamil homeland, any demands for collective expressions of Tamil identity, any political grouping, say, in the diaspora, well, that was just LTT. And I recognise that officials from the Sirisena government have said that that is completely out of order and that is really xenophobic. But I think that there's a core point. There are two core points here. One is that it's a domestic mechanism calling for accountability. And if you read the reports in relation to the Act, the national authority that is going to implement the Act, in other words, doing things like setting up safe houses and ensuring protection of witnesses and judiciary and examiners and so on, well, they're the police, okay? And that is going to be a big stumbling block in terms of the ability of Tamil witnesses to come forward and engage on a really basic level. Because if you were in Mulaivaikal and if you're part of those who've been sent to the no-fire zones, or if you're someone who has suffered long-term detention and torture or systematic rape, and the people who are implementing your safety are actually in uniform, maybe not in uniform, but the police or soldiers, that's going to be a really big stumbling block. I would say it's probably an insurmountable obstacle. So unless you have an independent protection mechanism within Sri Lanka, I can pretty much guarantee that whatever the political will is, unless there is institutional change, and unless basically there is a desire to have a hybrid type organisation where you have credible members of the international community, such as jurists and investigators, working with the domestic apparatus for investigation, you're really not going to get you're not going to get very far in terms of the witnesses. And obviously the reason that we're having this discussion today, is because we want to be really victim-centric in the way that we look at the questions for accountability. So that's one core problem. And I think that, the thematic point is that a domestic mechanism per se, whilst it shows the international community, and I believe that many officials really are committed to this idea. If the implementing, if the guardianship, and if the protective mechanisms are going to be officers of the state in various guises, you're really not going to have any Tamil victims or potential witnesses coming forward. And that's why you cannot have a domestic mechanism that's working in isolation from the international community. And I remember talking to Francis about this, that if you look at the words that are used in terms of the domestic mechanism, which is really important, words are used like prioritising engagement with the OISL, and looking at the OISL as an advisory body. And I think that's quite telling, because I think the bottom line here, and this is the line that a lot of Tamils will be asking, is, are people going to be let in? Is there going to be a direct engagement with the international community? Because it should be seen in two separate ways. You don't have the domestic mechanism that goes on and does their thing, and then produces their report, and then produces it by September? Because that's crazy. Because that's with all the best will in the world, that's not going to happen. And so you've got the OISL, and they really need to be working in conjunction with the domestic mechanisms. And if the bill was only enacted in February, then we've still got a long way in terms of Sri Lankan institutions, in terms of developing and actually constructing those mechanisms, particularly in Jaffna, which takes me to another point. Now, there are other institutional barriers that are key, and that is the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and there have been no suggestions by the government of Sri Lanka that the PTA, which for 30 years has been responsible for a complete lack of accountability in terms of victims of torture, providing for long-term detention without trial, detention without any judicial scrutiny, extrajudicial arrests and detentions in the context of emergency regulations. Unless that goes, again, that's going to be a massive, insurmountable barrier to getting involved in domestic mechanisms. Why? Because if we're looking at those who actually are going to be making the allegations of war crimes, those who have faced torture or have witnessed egregious acts of war crimes, they're going to be people who are from former LTT territories. And a significant number of them are going to be people who were involved in the LTT to a lesser or a greater extent. Now, obviously, as any investigator would know, taking of a witness statement is a very sensitive and difficult thing, because a proper statement could take days, and you're disclosing everything about your entire family history and about your own background, a lot of which could well provide the evidence that's necessary for you to be arrested and detained to the PTA. So basically, unless the PTA is repealed, that is another insurmountable obstacle towards any proper engagement. In other words, getting the victims out voluntarily and going in there and participating. So that's the second problem. And the third problem, I want to talk about the question of Tamil identity, which is really important. I mean, everything that's been said by the government, as I've said before, is very positive, and that's why so many Tamils did vote, partly because they really hated the Rajapaksa regime as well. But the question of Tamil identity is one that's always caused a lot of difficulties. As a refugee lawyer, it's always difficult for me to explain that if you get involved in political organisations in the UK, such as the British Tamil Forum or the TGT or the host of other organisations, you're not supporting the LTT, and you're not trying to have the LTT back again in Sri Lanka. What you're doing is you're saying, I support self-determination, I support Tamil statehood, and I support, in various different forms, a Tamil state. A Tamil state not built as a result of violence, but one that one where there is a political solution that recognises that Tamil autonomy, Tamil ownership of land, Tamil expressions of cultural and political identity in different forms, which includes, say, Mahavir Nal, Heroes Day, commemorating those who've died in battle and the many civilians who've died, and commemorating Mulai Vaikul every year in the UK, 80th of May, thousands of Tamils will come to commemorate the many thousands who died. Now, if you did that in Sri Lanka under Rajapaksa, that would be seen, well, you wouldn't be able to do it for a start, but that would be seen as support for the LTT. And one of the problems that's always existed as far as the Rajapaksa mind frame is, and I think that a lot of the current government would accept that this was a way of enhancing support for the regime in Sri Lanka, is an inability to separate support for Tamil separatism, a Tamil homeland, Tamil identity, and Tamil Erlam, which for Tamils, and I say that there is a very strong collective consciousness amongst the Tamil diaspora and Tamils in Sri Lanka. The historical will to have a separate state is one that is pervasive within the Tamil community. Now, unless the government of Sri Lanka can take that on board and deal with that and not sort of characterise it as meaning, well, you're a terrorist or you're a member of the LTT, unless that can be properly recognised and respected, then again, it would be very, very difficult for the Tamil people to engage with the process. And that brings me on to the next topic, which is, of course, militarisation of the North. Now, my parents went to Jaffna and they stayed in a hotel and they said, this is Shivani, everything's changed, it's really good now. And of course, there are always a lot of changes around the time of elections. We've got to be really quite pragmatic about this. But the point is that militarisation is continuing in the northern provinces, and in fact the spokesman for the Sri Lankan army stated that no decision has been taken to reduce the number of troops in the military, noting instead that more than 20,000 people have been recruited into the armed forces for development projects. Now, again, you're simply not going to have people in the north and the northeast who are living in a militaristic environment wanting to go forward and give evidence to a domestic mechanism which is policed by the police and where various levels of Tamil identity coupled with disclosure of their backgrounds, basically that the troops have to leave the north and the northeast. The PTA has to be repealed. There has to be a recognition that those who seek Tamil self-determination are not a threat to the Sri Lankan unitary state. They're not enemies. You can be a Sri Lankan. You can be a Sri Lankan and you can be somebody who wants a free Tamil land in the north and the northeast, as opposed to them being broken up, as opposed to the continuing controversies over land, which, unless those problems are solved, then these are institutional problems, and they are also questions of political will as well. But all of these issues are completely silent in terms of the enactment, the recent enactment. So it's not just a question of legislative change and change in officials. The change that we're looking for is far more fundamental. Just to give you an illustration, when the March resolution took place, all the Tamil, pretty much most of the Tamil diaspora organisations were prescribed. And for many who were involved in that, because they wanted to go to the community and get evidence, it was a real stumbling block. It basically, single-handedly, the government of Sri Lanka prevented many, many, many Tamils from being able to give evidence, because they were going to do it through the conduit of these organisations. Now, Tamils who are involved in these political organisations, they really need to have the right to be involved in these organisations. Even British Tamils, if they're involved in these organisations, continue to face the risk of arrest and detention on return. Now, I've heard talk about possible deprescription of these groups, but there are certain things, core things, that we, and I can safely say we, because these are issues that bring together so many Tamils from so many different political organisations. The reason Tamil supported this is because it is the first step, but there are fundamental changes, and whether those changes can take place by September, it's a long shot, really. And the only way to make that happen is if these domestic mechanisms that are going to be set up, they're a baby at the moment. You know, we're taking baby steps. The government of Sri Lanka is taking baby steps. But they can take strides if they work with the international community and share their resources and their expertise and the personnel and get rid of any allegations of a lack of impartiality and independence. So these are good things, but share your information with the international community and give us the statistics and identify those who are in the hierarchy of command during what to the Tamil people was genocide in May 2009. Do that and you will have the greatest cooperation from witnesses and trust.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to call on Kirsty to maybe go into some of the actual crimes and outline them, because we've taken it for granted that everybody knows what happened and what the mandate of the investigation is. It actually runs from 2002 till November 2011, and it mirrors a period that was investigated by a domestic commission inside Sri Lanka, and that's why it's got these quite sort of arbitrary dates. And so it covers the peace process period in Sri Lanka, the final phase of the conflict, and 2 years after the war. And there's also an ongoing watching brief of OHCHR to look at ongoing issues in Sri Lanka as well, aside from the actual investigation.
Thank you very much. I know that introduction probably puts people off slightly, the lawyer's time, so if you can just bear with me. A lot of you, I was sort of looking around and I recognise a number of faces. A lot of you are very immersed as to what has been going on in Sri Lanka in recent years. But I'm going to, so those of you who are, if you can just bear with me, I'm going to go through a little brief history of how we got up to the OISL. And then I'm going to try and answer the question. And no doubt you will have your views on on the question as well, as to whether this delay is helpful to the victims. I mean, in a way, it's the answer itself is in the question a little, but it doesn't mean that we can't debate around it. So I'm going to start with the Secretary General's panel of experts on accountability in Sri Lanka. And that reported on the 31st of March 2011, having started its work on the 16th of September 2010, and it was set up in the early part of 2010. So obviously nothing moves terribly quickly in the UN, but there we go, that's perhaps an aside. But the starting point with the legal position, and this is undisputed by Sri Lanka because it can't dispute it, is that there's a duty on the state, so in this case we're talking about Sri Lanka, to investigate alleged violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and to prosecute those responsible. Now that's a fundamental, and it's not picking on one country. That applies as many other investigations going on at the moment. And in fact, last night I was talking on a panel specifically in relation to the UK, and for that I just checked how many cases are going against the UK at the moment for its conduct in Iraq between 2003 and 2009, and it's over 1,000 judicial review claims are pending, plus 1,000 more, over 1,000 more for claims for compensation. So our courts are also grappling with those issues on extraterritorial jurisdiction, the liability of the UK concerning what happened in Iraq during that period. But back to Sri Lanka. The panel of experts report, those of you who haven't read it, it's actually worth a read. It's very comprehensive and very detailed. And specifically, I can summarise its conclusions. It specifically found there to be credible allegations. Now, that's the only bar it has to reach. Credible allegations associated with the final stages of the war, so between September 2008 and May 2009. And it found that particularly concerning the military campaign in Varni, this is when there was an increasing number of people who were trapped on a smaller and smaller area. And it looked at the UN figures, which were put at between 45,000 and 75,000 people being killed in that period of 90 days. Now, the figures obviously are disputed, as you all will know, but the other UN figure puts 150,000 people as missing. So it's only right, isn't it, that the international community is concerned. It'd be wrong if it wasn't. And those are my Twitter feed who've been tweeting about bias just simply by talking about it. I'm afraid I don't understand that. As I say, last night was the UK's turn, so frankly I don't really see any different in terms of international obligations. I am going to quote from one section from the report, and then I'm going to just deal with the credible allegations that the report found in relation to the LTTE and the government of Sri Lanka. Obviously it looks at both. One section of the report found that the government shelled on a large scale in 3 consecutive no-fire zones where it had encouraged the civilian population to concentrate, even after indicating that it would cease the use of heavy weapons. It shelled the UN hub, food distribution lines, and near the International Committee of the Red Cross ships that were coming to pick up the wounded and their relatives from the beaches. It shelled in spite of knowledge provided by its own intelligence systems and through notification by the UN and ICRC, and there's plenty of evidence from those bodies and others. And most civilian casualties in the final phases were caused by government shelling. Now, that paragraph in the report have led to a lot of attacks, but that is there, and there's a whole body of evidence supporting it from the ICRC and the UN in particular, so leaving aside civilian reports. But in terms of the LTTE, the panel determined that there were credible allegations against the LTTE in 6 core categories of potential serious allegations. And they are using civilians, it said, as a human buffer. More of us may be familiar with human shields, perhaps using the international language a little more familiar. Killing civilians attempting to flee, LTTE control, using military equipment in the proximity of civilians, forced recruitment of children, forced labour, killing of civilians through suicide attacks. So it's saying that needs to be looked into as potential war crimes against the LTTE. Against the government of Sri Lanka, it said that there were 5 categories of potential serious allegations, and they were the killing of civilians through widespread shelling, shelling of hospitals and humanitarian objects, denial of humanitarian assistance, human rights violations suffered by victims and survivors of the conflict, human rights violations outside the conflict zone, including against the media and other critics of the government. And it then made a series of recommendations for accountability, and they included the establishment of an independent international mechanism. But also, in the interim, that the government of Sri Lanka should take real steps to stop further acts of violence by the state, by actors of the state, surrogates of the state, and to stop any tolerance of the state of further acts of violence. Obviously, there was a whole host of other recommendations, but those are sort of 2 core ones which I would have thought are not terribly controversial. Now, my involvement in cases in Sri Lanka in particular detail came last year. And the Bar Human Rights Committee brought together a team of lawyers, and they comprised 6 barristers and 1 solicitor, and they joined with 2 other international lawyers to collect evidence in relation to what's been going on since the end of the conflict, so post-May 2009. And I'm sure you've all read this fantastic report. It's called An Unfinished War, Torture and Violence in Sri Lanka 2009 to 2014. Now, it was launched at the Canadian Embassy last year, and it was been presented at the UN with a Sri Lanka representative, which we can talk about a little later if needed, who came to attend to be asked questions, and a large number of other countries also attended. Now, it's a small survey, but it is of note. There were 40 people who were interviewed by the team. They were not known to each other, and they were half men and half women. And they all alleged abduction, torture, rape, sexual violence committed against them by Sri Lankan security forces during this time frame. Now, more than half took place during 2013-2014, and almost all the incidents were post-2011. And the witnesses' accounts were supported by detailed medical and psychiatric reports in 32 out of 40 cases. And in addition, there were a further 40 statements. In addition to the 40 statements, there were 57 medico-legal reports relating to different cases which came through immigration lawyers. And all the allegations were against high-ranking officers in the army, members of the Criminal Investigation Department, Terrorist Investigation Division, and other members of the police force. They were identified by a variety of sources, and the barristers and solicitor who took the statements did not collaborate and discuss their findings. They were put together by a different team. And then I had a separate team as well who came in for the report and brought the legal section into the report. And so it's a fairly compelling pattern which then emerged, which could not be said to be one which was contaminated. In relation to detention, out of 40 of the cases, in terms of abduction in white vans, there was 30. There was an account of 30 people who complained of the abduction being in a white van. 28 heard and saw others being tortured. In relation to torture, 20 described being beaten by pipes. 28 described being hurt with cigarettes. 26 experienced this torture of the use of chili peppers, being hung as well over the smoke from the chili. 28 suffered artificial drowning, being submerged in water. Sexual abuse, 17 women complained of vaginal anal rape, 12 men complained of anal rape, 21 of forced oral sex, 15 of gang rape. 35 out of 40 were forced to sign a confession in, obviously in the language that they did not understand. Out of 40 people, and this is something which perhaps is particularly distressing, 19 out of those 40 attempted suicide subsequently. Now, the methodology, without going into too much detail, you can ask questions if you like, was extremely robust by the lawyers who were taking the statements, and followed the recognised methods as set out in the Istanbul Protocol. The international law framework as to what this means, well, certainly it means that there's been a very obvious violation there in terms of post-conflict in terms of international law, I'm afraid there's always some give and take in times of armed combat. But when it ceased, these were very disturbing findings. International law framework, very briefly. Torture, well, Sri Lanka's ratified the Convention Against Torture. So that means it's got a duty to ensure that an individual is not subjected to torture, but also it's got a positive obligation to investigate allegations of torture. It's no different to any other state who's ratified that. I shall skip over a little on that. There's also been further support for the Bar Human Rights Committee findings by the committee against the UN Committee Against Torture, which also has expressed concerns. Arbitrary detention. Well, this is prohibited by Article 9 of the ICCPR, and in these cases as well, obviously no minimum fair trial standards were applied. Nobody was charged, nobody was taken to court, no access to a lawyer. So there's a whole host of breaches there. Also, Sri Lanka's ratified CEDAW, so it's a whole host of violations in terms of discrimination against groups and discrimination, including Tamils and women. Now, skipping on to back to the UN, the resolution that's been referred to in 2014, which was adopted in March, was on promoting reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. And the UN Human Rights Council requested the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to undertake a comprehensive investigation into alleged serious violations and abuses of human rights and related crimes by both parties in Sri Lanka during the period, as Francis has said, covered by a domestic setup called Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. So that was the investigation, and the period was between the 15th of February 2002 to the 21st of February 2002 to the 15th of November 2011. And that report and the centre of the discussion this evening has been delayed. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? We all automatically think in terms of delay as being a bad thing. Now, you've heard already 2 addresses around that. One of the points that is made is that you must give a chance, mustn't you, for engagement with a new regime, with a new government. And that must be right, mustn't it? But, and in fact, one thing I would say that again in international law, when you talk about accountability, it sort of has 3 strands to it, of truth, justice and reparation. But also acknowledgement by the state of its role and responsibility in violating the rights of citizens when it's occurred. And that is seen as very important. So it must be right to give Sri Lanka the space to see if it will acknowledge any violations, or to say, we say that there's no violations here and we have nothing to acknowledge. So it's giving the new regime a chance in that respect. Delay obviously has the negative side in that victims feel under particular stress. There's real issue over protection of people, and that has to be in place at this very delicate time. Because there's also, when you have delay, you have the corollary of will evidence be lost? And that relates sadly to people as well as forensic evidence. In terms of what the UN's saying, now the Canadians have been very strong in terms of challenging Sri Lanka. But the Canadians are there, along with all the other states, in support of the delay and allowing this chance and this space for the new regime to be engaged. And Switzerland said the following: the signs of cooperation from the new government of Sri Lanka with regards to accountability and reconciliation are encouraging. Switzerland particularly welcomes the government's intention to cooperate with the High Commissioner with a special rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation and guarantees of non-recurrence, and the working group on enforced or involuntary disappearances. So what is key is really what does happen in this period between March and September. There has to be real engagement with dialogue. Otherwise, it would just simply be pushing evidence back towards the end of the year, and that would not be in anybody's interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to pick up on that last point, I think the Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice is going by the end of this month, and the Working Group on Disappearances are going in the summer to Sri Lanka, but clearly not the actual investigative team for OISL. I think, given you've done a lot of listening, and it's quite hard work to listen to several people for a long time, I'll give you all a chance to come up with questions now, and I'd like you to focus on a question, not a speech or a statement, if you don't mind, and please also identify yourselves. Please, sir. Or could you identify yourself?
My name is Callum Macrae. I'm a barrister in a set of chambers called Garden Court Chambers. Now, I'm a socialist, right? And I'm a Sri Lankan. And you might say I'm a patriot. I'm not going to just ask a question, because it seems to me that this whole meeting has been described as a debate. And this is not a debate. What we've had here is not a debate. So therefore, to debate, it is necessary not just to ask questions, but also to correct you about certain things. There are two of your members who constantly refer to the Sri Lankan government, whether it's the past or the present, as a regime. You see, this is part of the problem with you people. You people of this disposition who treat a elected government, even the newly elected Sri Lankan government, as a regime, are displaying something about their prejudices. The problem here is a lack of trust, and I have always believed that the answer to Sri Lanka's problems is not interference from the West or the international so-called community. They're more interested in meddling in other people's affairs than ever, looking at their own hypocrisy and then their conduct of their violence throughout the international, everywhere, Vietnam, everywhere else, right? There's no answer to any of these things, but they're hell-bent on interfering in the affairs of the third world, and in particular, black people's efforts to be independent. Now, this is an important thing. From a socialist perspective, it is necessary to understand what is going on here. What is necessary in Sri Lanka is not for people from the outside pretending to be interested in the welfare of Sri Lanka, interfering in the Sri Lankan dynamics. It is for the people themselves of Sri Lanka, the Tamils and the Sinhalese, the Muslims and the Burghers and everyone else, to engage and find a political process that's right for them. And this is the development which I think Shivani has quite rightly identified. This is the space that is now occurring, and let history judge this. Perhaps there will be some improvements in the future, but not as a consequence of this meddling from the West.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me put that to Shivani to respond to first, and then maybe Callum wants to go ahead.
Okay, just on a regime change, I think that's just a term of art. It's not a. If I did use it, I didn't mean it in a sort
I don't
of.
think you did.
I think I used it actually, and I certainly didn't mean it in any way of displaying some prejudice. So
for a lawyer, you ought to be, pretty good at it.
Well, it depends who your audience is, I'm afraid, in a lot of respects. But
Can we
carry on?
Shivani answer first? You can have a say in a minute.
Yeah.
I'm a socialist too. I have been since I was 14, and it goes against the grain for me to have any kind of international intervention in the doings of any country. And to be quite, if I was being really honest, I think for a lot of Tamil activists, they're not placing all of their hopes in the international community because they know that there are geopolitical considerations at work. It just so happens that our interests in terms of human rights coincides with the resolution at a particular time. We know we can be dumped at any moment. I foresee that that's something that's probably going to happen given the changes in the relationship between Sri Lanka and the US and soon to be the UK. So, you know, we're very circumspect. Now, the only reason that the Tamil diaspora are active is because Tamils can't be active in the north. And I'll just give you one example of that. Jegarajah, okay? The case of Jegarajah, you remember when David Cameron went to Jaffna and he had women hanging off his shoulders saying, you know, Jegarajah and her daughter with the placard saying, please find my husband, please find my father. And then she was detained. She was detained during the lobbying of the UN over the March resolution, and only now she's being released. But she's not allowed to see her daughter because her daughter is in, I think she's still in, she's being held. If Tamils in the north could engage with the authorities and civil society, do you not think that that is the first thing that we would wish to be doing? You know, Tamils also joined with Sinhalese in terms of the socialist movements and the political parties in the 50s and 60s. And my memory, although I wasn't around at that time, I've done enough reading to know that that is something that I've really respected about the Sri Lankan left. So I completely agree with you. Now, if we could, we would, but we can't. And that's why the Tamil diaspora are able to do it in so-called liberal democracies to the best that we can. And that's how I respond. Give us that political space, but that means demilitarising the north, letting us express our identity, ensuring that we're not going to be arrested under the PTA, deprescribing our organisations. Do that, and we won't have to go to the UN.
Callum, you wanted to say
Yeah,
something?
I just wanted to come on. I think one of the problems, and this very often happens at these kind of discussions, is that we're talking about very, very serious evidence of extremely serious crimes. And the people who are attempting to avoid confronting these issues start objecting to the use of language like regime, or start coming up with the argument of this being Western interference. I think it's important to remember the reality of the situation. That was the argument the Rajapaksa regime used. But let's look at the history. The Rajapaksa regime launched its final offensive in 2008, 2009, using the language of the war on terror. Rajapaksa stood up and constantly spoke about the global war on terror, said we are part of the global war on terror, and justified his entire offensive as part of that Western agenda and used that Western language. Then something very funny happened. Immediately after the war, he turned it on its head and he did a very clever speech to the United Nations in 2010, in which he said, right, exactly what you said, word for word almost what you said, you've learned his speech. He said that it is now we've defeated terrorism, the West and everybody else must back off. We need to find local solutions. We need to find culturally legitimate solutions. We need to find homegrown solutions. And he came up with this great long speech, and of course it played very, very well with the Global South, and with various people who quite understandably, and with whom my sympathies lie. I think if America starts telling you, my immediate instinct, if America starts telling you something is true, then I'm inclined to believe it's not. So I come from the same position. I'm socialist as well, we're all socialists. The thing, that speech, which was very, very clever and transformed the whole debate, was written for him by a company called Bell Pottinger, Margaret Thatcher's favourite PR company, Sir Timothy Bell, who was a great friend of Margaret Thatcher, and he had employed this Western public relations company. They were in his presidential office, and they wrote his speech for him, and we know that because they were secretly filmed boasting about how they'd written that speech for him. This anti-imperialist stance is a piece of nonsense. I would say to you something rather different. I would say to you, and I certainly am a great believer in self-determination. I'm a great believer in the things that most inspire me in this world are the way that, for example, Western British colonialism was defeated by people demanding the right to self-determination, by people saying we have the right to a democratic process. That is what the Tamils are saying. To dress that up as some kind of to dress up the denial of the rights to the Tamils and the enforcement of that denial by the use of war crimes as some kind of anti-imperialist thing, I'm afraid it's just a piece of sophistry. The reality is that, and let's be serious about it, having dealt with that, because I do think that's a nonsense, and I think that we just need to knock that on the head. But there are very serious issues, which are, when does the international community intervene? When should the international community intervene? And I think that this is a very, very difficult situation. The fact is that the responsibility to protect this fundamental principle, which says that if people are suffering war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, whatever those categories, then it is the responsibility. I said this before. It's the responsibility of the state to prevent it. If the state doesn't prevent it, then the international community has a duty and a right to intervene. That principle, the responsibility to protect, was passed unanimously at the United Nations, and everybody voted for it, including Sri Lanka. And that is the principle in which we say, as a last resort, and what we should be saying to the people of Sri Lanka now is that everybody in Sri Lanka who wants, the vast majority of people, all Sinhala people, Tamil people, the Muslims, everybody all want to live in peace, in democracy, and live in a beautiful country in peace, right? The fact is that what has happened so far has made it necessary, I'm afraid, for the international community to assist Sri Lanka and to find a way out of this, to find a way to truth and justice, and to set up the process which should lead to peace and reconciliation. That's not actually Western imperialism at all. It's an absolute nonsense to pretend it is. That is actually the beginnings of some kind. That is a process which is very important in terms of the international community.
And sorry, I just have to come back again. That is a really, really good question, because first of all, this is not about communalism. I have to stress, because I wouldn't be alive and my family wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for the fact that Sinhalese people helped us during the 1983 pogrom. So I just have to say that it's got nothing to do with communalism currently. It's a political issue, and I want the left in Sri Lanka to be built, and I want I want the Sinhalese left and the Tamil left to be built in Sri Lanka. I would like nothing more than that, but there are basic conditions in terms of recognising Tamil rights, and if socialists in Sri Lanka could take that on board and make that a priority, then there would be no need, I believe, for having to depend or look to the West for accountability. Do more in Sri Lanka.
Can I just come back?
I think Kirsty wanted to respond first, if you don't mind.
Just a quick point. I don't think anybody would wish for anything other than self-determination of a country. And I actually started my talk, and the debate bit is happening now, if we want to pick on where's the debate. But I actually started my talk referring to the number of cases that are currently pending against the UK in relation to its actions in Iraq. So I really don't, I think that the bias that can creep in here is one which is perhaps understandable and driven by emotion, and it's understandable emotion. But international law and human rights law, of course, came out of World War I and then post-World War II. And that was the world throwing its hands up in shame and horror at what had happened by a democratically elected government when the rest of the world did nothing. And it was a never again. And this is why all the nations, including Sri Lanka, ratified the various international treaties to say never again. You cannot trust my elected government, an elected government in another territorial jurisdiction in certain circumstances, to do what is right by its civilian population. And so that is why you have human rights. And I think this is important. Human rights are universal. So I do question meddling, because you're basically saying that international law, which is supported by all those states that have ratified the ICCPR, predominantly Sri Lanka, India and so on, are saying that we reject that treaty, and Sri Lanka has never said that, and not at all. So I'm very surprised by that approach.
Okay, can I let somebody else? I'll come back.
Can I just come back?
Will you be very brief? And then, because I really do need to let other people speak, but I appreciate the debate.
The difficulty that you probably don't understand is that the history of Sri Lanka, right, the recent history of 400 years of colonialism, that taught us one thing. Where you get people introducing a divide and rule strategy, and that's exactly what destroyed the independence of Sri Lanka, is something that makes people within Sri Lanka not just nervous about this thing happening again, but unfortunately, the voices of criticism are coming from the very same people who caused that misery, right? Yeah. And that's why I say the only way forward for Sri Lanka is not for lawyers, By the way, as a lawyer, I'm very aware of the way in which lawyers make money out of this. This is a money-making business as well. Human rights has become a big enterprise for lawyers to make big-time money. Having people prosecuted,
That was the case for
etc.
me.
So
Can I say it's all pro bono? The Bar Human Rights Committee work is all pro bono, so you really need to do your research properly.
Okay, I'm going to let this gentleman speak because I think we need to diversify a bit. Sir, could you identify yourself, please?
I'm Faisal Gauss, I'm a retired engineer.
Thank you.
Talking about hypocrisy, what about the problems in the Middle East? 4,000 people were killed and slaughtered. Where is anything happening about that? And the Chilcot inquiry...
Are you going to ask something specifically about Sri Lanka? Because
No, I'm just telling you the double standard.
Well, where's the double standard? I've made more films about British war crimes in Iraq than I have about Sri Lanka. Two public inquiries were set up as a result of films I've made. I've spent, as far as I'm concerned, I don't like war crimes. And I don't care whether they're committed by Britain or by Sri Lanka or by the LTTE. They are war crimes, and I will investigate them.
Where in the Middle East where lots of people died, and that was not focused at all.
Okay, I think this has been answered.
yeah.
I mean, I think Kirsty's already answered it already.
I work in all those
I'd
places.
like to ask
This lady,
a
yes.
question.
Who's
I'm Rhea, I'm from Freedom Talk Show. I'm here with Sonia, and we're very interested to hear all the views tonight. And Callum, I'm just very interested, you raised this thing, I'm kind of in the world of PR, and you mentioned the government's use of PR companies, and I just was very interested in any information you had to share on that, what you thought of the role of the PR companies, if you've got any information on that, and what's happening with the new government and their employment of them.
And well, certainly, I think. I mean, there is I think almost the single and most significant employer of public relations companies was the Rajapaksa regime, who had more public relations companies working for them than you could imagine. I don't think it's a key issue. I mean, I think that what is key is this kind of nonsense which is being portrayed, which is that this is a question of the West interfering. That is the nonsense. It is a public relations stunt. It bears no relation to reality. I can quite happily give you all the details about what actually happened in that interview. There were a group of journalists who pretended to be from a dubious regime and asked these senior people from Bell Pottinger, what do you think? What can you do for us? Because they had nothing to do with it. They were just investigating and Bell Pottinger then came out with this story about, for example, we read President Rajapaksa's speech, so it was an interesting revelation. I think it's important because I think that we need to knock that on the head, because the point is that lots of countries instinctively buy into it. And it is just without basis. What is at issue here are issues of human rights, universal human rights, are issues of self-determination. They are actually the kind of issues which the rest of the world, and the Global South particularly, should be engaging with. And if they did engage with them and got through the nonsense that the Sri Lankan government was peddling and is still to some extent peddling, then I think we'd be in a different situation.
Okay, I think you had a question, or has it been answered? Because I've noticed you
Yeah.
before, yes, with your hand up.
I have several questions.
Well, can you,
Yeah.
given the amount of interest and the amount of time, narrow it to one, please?
One question is, has anyone read Professor Michael Newton's opinion on war crimes in Sri Lanka? Well, you've got several lawyers here.
No.
No. Maybe I should send that to you, because I think he gave a very
I've got the De Silva and Crane one. Is this
No.
post that one?
It's, I think, maybe a part of that, but it's an opinion given by Professor Michael Newton, and it basically went into the whole issue of the things that you mentioned, Kirsty, the war crimes allegations that the LTT made, and then the allegations against the Sri Lankan army, and then the issue of whether the Sri Lankan army used proportionality and distinction in carrying out the war. And I think his opinion was that they were within their rights to observe the prosecution of the war in which they did. I'd like to see what you saw about that opinion, really.
Yeah, I mean that's a similar conclusion to the De Silva Crane conclusion, which is causing some controversy at the moment. because of his role, Silva's role as an advisor.
Yeah, I understand that, but that's not the issue.
Yeah, it's not the issue. Well, I mean, those are the opinions of
Sure. And what's yours?
Well, I mean, that's why you have an independent inquiry. I mean, it would be wrong for me to say I can give you an opinion whether there's been war crimes or not on that basis. It would be completely wrong, because then I would be falling into that trap of saying something which isn't fully researched. You have to look at all the evidence. I've not done that. That's why I said my speciality in terms of cases in Sri Lanka was simply these 40 cases, what's been happening, what's the government been doing post-conflict, and it was a very disturbing findings.
Okay, so I think we'll give the floor to somebody else to ask a question, and clearly the OISL report will look at those arguments of proportionality, and it'll be very interesting to see what they come up with on that, and whether they agree with the opinion of Professor Newton or Desmond de Silva. Okay, go ahead, sir.
But I will read it, I should say. Thank you for that.
I represent non-resident tribals of Sri Lanka. First of all, postponement of the report is a welcome thing because it gives an opportunity for the UNHCR to investigate further, possibly come out with further substantial information to say what are involved. So that is an issue. Of course, there is widespread condemnation. There is generally feeling within the Tamil community, I will say, very silent majority of the Tamil community, postponement is welcome. That is, I can feel it. Number two, with regard to my colleague who made a very strong statement about the socialist ideas, the very socialist in Sri Lanka, number of them, monitored by Rajapaksa, they were sympathetic and supportive of the atrocities committed in Sri Lanka. They never came out publicly, protested, made a statement or anything, and how can they be socialist? And one particular minister, he came and said, at the wartime, there were two LTT men who were taken into captivity by the army. They were, people have seen it, I have witnesses to confirm. He said they were killed in the crossfire. They were taken by the army. So these are the socialists. Still they are unable to open their eyes and say the facts. These are real socialists we are talking about.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Clearly, the socialists fall on both sides, because I mean there are some Sinhalese leftists in Sri Lanka who've been very staunch on the issue of war crimes. So I guess you get them on all sides. Maybe the gentleman with the moustache, and then you.
It's a question of quite about the.
Could you identify yourself, sir?
The prosecutions in Sri Lanka, if there are any prosecutions, would that empower Rajapaksas? Would we see a return to Rajapaksas?
That's an interesting question. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is an issue here, and I mean, actually, again, I come back to principle rather than tactics. I think I personally would be very concerned if I thought that the OISL report was being used politically to serve one faction or another. It worries me deeply, the idea that you might delay it because it might benefit Sirisena, for example, which has been said. You might not expect me to say that, but that is what I think. I think that's a really I think that I wouldn't be happy about at all, because this is an independent judicial process. In terms of prosecutions, I mean, the problem is that the vast majority of people in Sri Lanka, particularly Sinhalese people, do not know what happened. There is a profound ignorance about what happened. It's a deliberate one. They have been denied the truth, and they have been fed lies in equal measure. And so that's why the process of truth and the process of justice and prosecutions that would come from that is nothing that anybody should. The only people who need to fear the truth are the guilty. But actually getting to that stage, I appreciate, is hugely difficult because of the legacy of distrust, because of the ultimate nationalism, the chauvinism encouraged by the last regime, and I'm afraid pandered to by the new regime, new government, whatever you want to call them. I'll call the last one the last regime a regime without any hesitation. The new government, and I'll take your correction on that. I'm afraid they do also pander to that. So there are huge problems, and that's why I think it is. I outlined at great length why I think that all the signs are there will not and cannot be a domestic inquiry, which has the trust of the victims and also has the trust of the vast majority of the community. That's why I think there has to be an international process. and that international process will be difficult, will be fraught, and will cause fear amongst people who have been misled about what went on. But ultimately, it has to be done, because the alternative is that the whole thing happens again.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I've just read the conclusions to the Michael Newton report. Seriously, if you really think that this has any credence or is sustainable in any way, if your families were caught up in the war and it was justified on the basis of the conclusions here, then really there is no way that we can go forward. What is in this report? And certainly the conclusions. I've read the proportionality argument many times in many different forms. Is wrong. The point of the matter is, and you know, I saw clients coming out of 2009. Okay, I represented those who came out, and they were from Vanley. You know, they weren't particularly sophisticated, and I heard story after story after story. And they weren't stories. I mean, they were real. And after 21 years, I can tell the difference between someone who's made something up and not. I said to some people, you know, you've made it up, and they weren't from Vanley at all. But to call the killings of civilians as something that was necessary when you look at the war in the round, in terms of you know, the overall benefit is quite frankly
with respect,
really quite sick.
I mean, it's a very long report.
Okay, well then let her read it and take this offline.
To provide it to you.
I've got
It's
it.
online,
No,
isn't it?
I know you have, but you just read the very last bit.
Okay, well let her read it and come back to you and argue it
Fine,
properly.
I think
This gentleman's
I've
waiting
heard
to ask a
the
question.
proportionality argument.
Okay,
That's
you
where
can
it
take
comes
this argument off, you know, at the end of the discussion. I want to give other people a chance to speak, so maybe this gentleman's been waiting.
Do the panel overall?
Who are you? Sorry.
My name is Rajan York.
Yeah.
And does the panel overall give way to the fact that this government, with all its utterances and its policies, to be given the opportunity to cooperate? No government in the world, no country in the world has external investigations. No one. They always have the internal investigation. But we need the cooperation of the UNHCR to have an internal investigation. And I think the investigatory body should be strengthened with the cooperation of the UNHCR. And every encouragement should be given to do that. And that's very important, I think. There is an element of deficit of trust between the Tamil diaspora in this country and also in Sri Lanka, and that has to be looked into in some way. There's definitely a deficit of trust that has been built over a period of time. And I like what's your view on this, because long term, I think Callum Macrae, you contradicted yourself when you said at one time, I very much want the investigation to have now, and then when you went on to say the regime wants to strengthen the investigative report by bringing in more information. So by that you are basically saying it's a one-sided report. There's more to it than meets the eye. So therefore we should give the opportunity for the rest of the people who want to have witnesses and others to achieve the truth. That's what we all are seeking at the end of the day.
Okay, I think Kirsty's going to respond to that very
I'm going to
quickly.
respond. Thank you very much for that. Of course, I would say Callum was busking, but he'll come on to it. He's maybe be contradicted. But I agree with what you say.
Yes.
I think there needs to be space for the current government
Absolutely.
to engage. Now, I think it's also quite useful. What's happened in Sri Lanka is not actually just about Sri Lanka. And practicing in international law, spent a lot of time in Colombia. There's a lot of parallels with what's gone on in Colombia. Only there, I have to say, there's less sort of rhetoric in terms of this is you lot meddling. There's although they are carrying out investigations themselves, every so often they pull from the international community to say, can you assist, support what's going on here, when everybody starts accusing each other. Particularly when you have government figures, those at the highest level who are accused. Now, the former president of Colombia has been accused on many occasions of being complicit in extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and so on. So it's very difficult when you have a regime of people who are still in Congress who are being accused of carrying out war crimes, and also they are part of the investigation. And that is why you have international law and those treaties to try and support those countries who are also doing themselves to help out with trying to sort out their own mess. So I don't really see it as meddling, and I agree with you giving the space with a united with the United Nations, international community supporting where it can, but certainly not interfering.
And I think
Gentleman at the back had a question.
Sorry,
Oh,
do you mind if I just correct?
do you want to
I was
contradict
malign.
yourself?
No,
Yeah, you were
I-
relied on your. Yeah.
I didn't contradict myself. What I said
I
was.
think you did.
What I said was that you said there were two interpretations of the delay. Zaid, the Human Rights Commissioner, said that that will allow the report to be strengthened, and that's why the delay could be good, because the investigators can go in, can strengthen the report, and it will be good for the report. What Mangala said was that we are asking for the delay so that we can set up a domestic inquiry. Those two things were different things, and the important thing is what happened afterwards, which was that Sirisena in this town, whenever it was 2-3 weeks ago, said very specifically, I am not letting the UN, the UN investigators do not need to come here because we're running our own inquiry. We will take the opinion of the UN. That's the problem. And I don't need to go through again why I think that domestic inquiry will be.
No, I think you've said that. Great. I'm going to ask the gentleman at the.
said that Sri Lanka is a model for the rest of the country, rest of the world.
Hold on a minute. Let me allow somebody else to speak.
Hi,
Okay, I'm just going to ask this gentleman at the back.
Darshan, I write for the Tamil Guardian, which is a human rights-based newspaper which focuses on predominantly the north and east of Sri Lanka. So a lot of the discussion here has been around kind of Sri Lanka and the people on the ground, and as well as the people in the diaspora. I guess since the new elections, we've seen a tale of two different stories. In the north and east, we've seen the biggest protests since May 2009, with the people coming out on the streets and calling for an international investigation. At the same time, we've seen countless resolutions by the democratically elected Northern Provincial Council, which is also calling for international investigation. Now, at the same time, we've seen the new government reject these resolutions as racist, like this is the actual terminology of the new Prime Minister. We've also seen President Sirisena come to the UK and reject some evidence of these war crimes and mass atrocities. Given that we've seen these two stories, and this is like the same kind of rhetoric we saw before the new regime came in, what happens in September? Because we all know the OISL is going to come out. There will be recommendations, and now I don't see any tangible steps from the Sri Lankan government to show that there is an actual, real change in stance. So what do we do in September from then?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we've been focusing so much on this report and the delay issue. We haven't really talked about what will happen when it comes out and whether it will actually bring any change on the ground.
Can I give you just a very brief response, because I know there's other people want to speak. It is quite interesting that sometimes, and you could see this in Northern Ireland at the times of the negotiations which led to the Good Friday Agreement, there would be, on occasions, there would be statements that were made, whilst underlying that there was dialogue going on. Now, I'm not saying that's happening here, I don't know, but that is, and also when you work in conflict resolution in other countries, I mean, Palestine, Israel are classic examples. Politically, sometimes leaders have to make statements, but they're also saying, I'm going to make this statement, okay, politically, because I need to do it, but something else is going on behind that. Now, I hope that's the case here, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, I think we should take a few more questions quickly. Let's have the two ladies here. You want to go first, Sonia?
Thank you. So, Sonia Speaks from Freedom from Torture. I have another genuine question. Like the Bar Human Rights Committee, we've been working for many years to be focusing on the post-conflict situation, and given our work on the torture that we know has been taking place since the end of the war. But of course, we've been working for a much longer time with victims of torture from Sri Lanka, and on the basis of that work, have very, very kind of grave concerns about any hasty assumptions that the power transfer in Colombo has translated into a dismantlement of the torture apparatus. And so I would be very interested to hear from each of the panellists what it would take for you to be satisfied that Sri Lanka had turned a corner on torture. What are the indicators that you would want to see in the case?
Okay, Shivani, maybe you should deal with that first, since you deal with survivors of torture.
Prosecution. I was reading Amnesty reports in 1993. Wow, that makes me really old. But I was running cases in 93 where Amnesty were producing reports about systematic torture in detention. And that's sort of like when you go to court and there's the Home Office and there's us, refugee practitioners, there's actually no debate about that. It's not an issue that torture is perpetrated on a systematic level. And the reason why is that there is total impunity in Sri Lanka. There have been no prosecutions, or if there have been a prosecution, it was a sort of like a relocation of a police officer to somewhere else. So if that is going to change, then there are plenty of cases. I'll give you an example. Judicial medical officers in habeas corpus cases in Sri Lanka and Colombo, they're actually instructed by the court to go and see whether the confession has been obtained by duress. And one of the best pieces of evidence you can get is a JMO's report, because it's a court doctor report saying, yes, this person's been tortured, and then the case is thrown out. A lot of the PTA cases are thrown out because you couldn't prosecute a case solely on confession evidence, which is why there's torture, as you know. So if there are these JMO reports, and you can clearly identify where the person's been arrested from, then prosecute them. And if you prosecute them, and there is accountability in that very basic respect, then that will send a message that no, you can't just go on torturing people. So start that prosecution. That's what I would say.
I'd agree. I'd say complaint whereby members of the family are not then harassed or hassled by the security forces, or worse, disappear. So if we have one of those, proceeding to a prosecution if there's sufficient evidence, that would be progress. I think there's been some progress that, Callum probably has got more in-depth knowledge on this than I have, but certainly this issue of white fanning almost became part of the vocabulary. Now, recently in a debate in Parliament, it was said that that is now very much decreased, that the white vans seem to have faded out, which at least is some progress. But
okay, and we're going to finish at 8 o'clock, I promise, because I know some people probably are anxious to end this and others want to carry on. But this lady here had her hand up, and I did promise you a question, so I'm afraid it'll be the last.
I'll keep it short.
Thank you.
My name is Thurston Hacken. I'm with Independent Diplomats, which is a small NGO. And my question is, what does the panel think that the government of Sri Lanka can do in order to show that they are genuinely concerned about justice accountability ahead of the release of the OISL report in September? What can they do to show that they are actually serious about it?
Okay, very briefly, kind of quick, snappy answers.
I think the bottom line is they have to demonstrate, for the situation to have changed in the UN, and for there not to be a report, and the next stage, if the report has happened, the next stage is the judicial process, the beginning of the judicial process. That's what I think that the United Nations should be voting on in September. How are we going to start the judicial process as a result of this report? To stop that happening, I think that Sri Lanka would have to endorse, would have to sign up to the Rome Statute, would have to commit itself to the International Criminal Court. There's no compromise in sovereignty there, because when you sign up to the ICC, you say, I'll deal with these crimes, I'll deal with these war crimes, I'll prevent them happening, and if they happen, I will prosecute them, and it's only if I fail that the international community should intervene. So that shouldn't be something that should frighten Sri Lanka. They need to sign up to it. If they don't sign up to it, they're demonstrating, it seems to me, that A, they do not promise to deal with these crimes themselves, and B, that they don't actually promise to prevent them happening in future. I think they need to. I think they need to incorporate a whole series of things into the law, because you can't have a domestic inquiry into war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, whichever of those are relevant, if you don't have them incorporated into your penal code. They are not incorporated. Sri Lanka cannot investigate those things. So unless it incorporates them into its penal code, then it has not shown that things have changed. There are a whole, and then of course there's the whole panoply of repression in the north.
Okay, so because you need to give everybody else a chance to speak briefly.
Then nothing has changed.
To me, it's very simple. Army, give us your footage. Just give us your footage of what happened in 2009. Give us all of your evidence. You want to expedite us? You want to expedite matters? You want to show whether or not you are culpable and you haven't committed war crimes? Give us your evidence.
Presumably you mean the drone footage?
Yeah.
Surveillance footage.
Yeah.
Okay. And Kirsty?
Put a huge amount of money into a robust, transparent scheme for protection of witnesses. That would be my...
Okay, well, on that extremely brief note, thank you so much, Kirsty. And also Shivani and Callum, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for being a great audience. Good night. Thank you.
No, I'm chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee. I'm a QC at Baptist Law Chambers. Nice to meet you too. Yes, of course. I have one, which I have. There we go. Yes, well, thank you. I was interested in your contribution.
I think not quite a contribution, but as a time
right.
Eastern province is completely neglected. They only talk about the north.
I know. I mean, it's always the way, isn't it? Where the selling was.